Hello, welcome to my presentation titled Tracking as Pedagogy for First Nations Early Childhood Learners. My name is Suzanne. I hope you find it interesting. Last year, I went on a great adventure, actually, and I went to work with representatives of First Nations of Quebec and Labrador near Quebec City. So I actually moved on an urban reserve called Wendake and spent a lot of time doing some research for the Assembly of First Nations and the commission that organizes services for the people. My main project was to propose a curriculum model for early childhood education for all the First Nations of the province. It was, like I say, an adventure. It was very interesting. The curriculum model was tabled and is now going through a consultation and validation process. I will tell you more about it in the following slides. So when I went to work with First Nations of Quebec and Labrador, I actually worked with representatives of the Algonquin community, the Huron-Wendat, and the Innu communities. I also met with some representatives of the Mohawk community. All the nations are very different from one another. So their expectations as far as the curriculum model was concerned was presented a very serious challenge. My past experience was mainly with the French and English communities of the province, and also with the Hasidic and Ashkenazim communities. It was, I have to say, it was a real privilege to meet with First Nations representatives, to be able to work on this project. It was, of course, very interesting. It's very, very important for me to say here that my presentation on tracking is really but a representation that I make. I am not First Nations, so it was my comprehension and a representation that I was able to do about tracking and using it in early childhood education and education to the environment. So, of course, tracking is a way of life for many, many individuals. After teaching early childhood education for almost 20 years at the university, I came to a point where I had many questions about the system in which we were raising young children in our part of the world. There are, when you look at the way First Nations raise their children, there are very interesting concepts, many interesting concepts, like holistic education and concentric circles of knowledge, all this question about the place and the breath and language, very fascinating concepts. In our system, in the modern system, we've been using developmental norms and developmental psychology as a basis for raising kids in daycare services, for example, or early childhood programs. But I came to a point where I was bothered by the fact that these developmental norms were in fact reductive and discriminatory towards young children. So I started looking for something else. I started analyzing how people across the world were raising their children and what they were using as an approach. So in my research, I came about this concept of autochtonization of early childhood education, which really really rattled my world. And as I studied it more and tried to understand what it meant, I think one of the basic ideas within the concept was the fact that the biocosmic nature of children as human beings was integrated in early childhood education. And this to me was fundamental. I hope I'm giving you enough time as I'm speaking to be able to read the content of the different slides. I hope it's working out. As you can see, I'm not a professional in productions of videos, but I'm doing my best. So let's talk about tracking, which is the subject of this presentation as such. So when we think about tracking, what comes to mind is hunting. Which is the first thing, and hunting is in itself a purpose. It's a purpose. It's something that you're doing, right? So it's the first step. The second step is what would come up to mind. It would be going into the forest or some environment where you would do the hunting, right? So the forest represents a place, a lieu. It's a place where you're going into to be able to perform the purpose, which is the hunting. Third step, you would follow a track. You would find one and follow it. And this would give you a direction. So a track necessarily has a direction. And this is important as we're going to use it later on in pedagogy. The fourth step would be picking up signs of presence of animals, because we're in a hunting process, right? So signs would represent like data, all sorts of information, if you wish, that you would pick up on the trail, on the path to pursue the animal that you're hunting. The fifth step would be dealing with obstacles like weather and geography, right? So when you're in the hunting process and you're on a path and you're using a direction, you will encounter obstacles, different types of obstacles. Now, these obstacles are going to establish a pace and a speed in your journey. Now, this is also very important. And the last step would be in this process of hunting and going into a place and adopting a direction and remembering all the information, the data that comes with it, and measuring yourself, if you wish, to all the obstacles. You would find yourself in a process of measuring yourself. So you would discover through this purpose of hunting, your strength and the amount of courage that you have and the capabilities of concentration and your determination. So it's all about the hunting process is and purpose is about discovering oneself and knowing what you're capable of, and of course living to tell the story. In the next slide, we're going to see how we adapt this to pedagogy for early learners. So let's talk about hunting. We can hunt for real in the real world, hunt animals or hunt for food, or we can talk about hunting metaphorically. As human beings, we need to change constantly. So we need new ideas, we need new perspectives, we need to see new things, live in new ways. So we're constantly transforming. And this is part of the human condition, and it's part of the condition of almost all and everything in the biosphere. So we need to, by hunting and finding new ideas and new concepts, we transform. And as long as we're transforming and growing and developing, we live. The day we stop transforming and developing, we start to die. So it's the human condition. So when we use the concept of hunting in our lives, it applies to everything, not just the real world and not just hunting for food. On the next slide, we're going to talk about tracking in the same way. So tracking for real or metaphorically. So when hunting and tracking, we first, as an approach, we first have to look far away. You know, you look far away in the environment to measure events and to pick up on data and to collect information about what's happening. And then you focus slowly towards the object of the hunting purpose. So tracking uses that mechanism of first looking from far away and then focusing on something specific. When in modern early child education, when we use provisional factors of development, we do the contrary. We focus on factors. So we start specifically, and then we use induction, and we try to make an analysis of, let's say, a situation with a child or its development or its condition. So tracking shows us to do the reverse of what developmental psychology has taught us all those years. So it's to first look at the context and of a person, to take notes of events and obstacles and accidents that occurs in a person's life, and then observe the direction and the speed of that person's development, considering everything that has happened, and then measuring the impacts of this tracking process. So tracking, that's what it means. It means taking into account not only cognitive elements, but also affective elements and physical elements, environmental elements that come into the development of a person. So it's more complex, if you wish. On the next slide, we'll talk about tracking specifically in child development and how this approach of tracking changes our ways of doing things. When we first talked about hunting, we associated the process of hunting with a purpose, right? And we then said, with hunting, you would think of going into the forest. So you need a place, you need a destination. There's a context, if you wish. Then you need to follow a track, which gives a direction as such. Then you would pick up signs, and you would remember data information. And you would be dealing also with obstacles and like weather and geography, and this would set the pace and speed of the journey, of someone's journey. Then this person would be able to measure its strength and its courage, and its concentration, determination as such. So if we take those concepts proposed by hunting itself, and we apply it to tracking in child development, this is what it offers us. So the purpose of tracking a child's development is identifying what we desire for the child. It's the purpose, right? What we desire for the child, what we hope for the child, what we're hoping to offer the child, and what we hope the child will become, and if it would have a good living condition and be able to be happy and be fulfilled and such. So that's the purpose. If you take in consideration the place would be in tracking child development, right? The place would mean that we'd have to take notes about elements in the child's environments, the different environments in which the child is developing. So we would take notes about the conditions within the family, of course, but within the daycare services also, or schools, or elements concerning friends and neighbors and relationships and the environment in which the child is living. So the house or the village, or and in natural environments, or if the child is growing up in an urban environment or in the countryside, for example. All these different elements are vital information to be able to understand a child's development. So with the place, we also have a direction. So development has a direction. as such, so the child will take different paths towards its development. A child might change the paths that it adopts, and the paths that they take in development also is in different perspective, in the sense that the child develops within the family, within family life, within his own family and extended family, but it also develops in a society, a cultural society of its own, but also modern society. And a child also develops in a natural environment. So there's a whole lot of information that is available within all these different settings, if you wish, that gives a direction to the development of the child. When we remember data, so when we're tracking, we have to take notes. We have to remember data. We have to remember elements, important elements that have happened in the child's life, like the birth story of the child, for example, is very important. All the accidents, the infections, and diseases that the child is exposed to, the different events the child encountered, the friends and the enemies the child had, and the people that helped him or did not support him, or and all the different life stages. So within this type of data, there's a whole bunch of elements that need to be looked at, need to be noticed, need to be written down, to be able to understand the development, the direction of the development, and the path that the child is taking. Within this development process, there's also the pace and the speed of the journey. So, of course, in a child's development, there are obstacles that cannot be bypassed. Others can be bypassed. Some obstacles you just have to live with and integrate into your life. You have to take into account also positive elements of information, like assets or talents or disposition a child might have. So you would have slow development or accelerated development, or stagnating development also, that can be caused by different elements. So tracking also means taking into account all those different elements. Finally, discovering oneself and living to tell the story. So when a child develops, of course, it goes from being not conscious of its environment and of itself. And this is knowledge that the child has to develop. And it has to also develop physically and affectively, intellectually, spiritually. The child has to discover its character, its temperament, its dispositions and talents, and all these dimensions of the child as a human being. You have within these dimensions, you have vital elements that have to be picked up so that we understand the course of development a child undertakes. So tracking a child's development is interesting because it also it represents a story to be told. So when you take into account all of these elements, there's a story, and we must tell that story, which makes it a very complex story. And the child must be told the story, and the child must learn to tell his own story. And when the child also listens to other stories, then they find themselves to be well rooted in time and space, and life makes sense, if you wish, for the child then. So development is not based on developmental norms or stages, or those are just tools that we use in developmental psychology. But child development is far more complex than developmental norms. So hunting and tracking and mapping all establishes or defines a child's story. a child's developmental story. On this slide, I will read the lines with you to be as clear as I can. So, telling a child's story is mapping numerous and complex elements that come into play in the child's development. Now, the element of complexity here is very important. So there's not one element that's determining on a child's life or a child's development. It's the combination of all those elements that's important. So mapping a child's development draws an inscape of who the child is. So imagine a landscape, okay, an inscape, so what's inside as opposed to what is outside of the child. So hunting, tracking, and mapping child development is the approach that is used. I'm reading it again, the next line. Inscape provides a foundation that enables human beings to resonate individual and communal inscapes with natural landscapes, so they understand their place in the biosphere and the cosmos. And here we come to this idea, this realization that in environmental education, this notion of the inside and the outside and how they're linked together is a reality within the biosphere. Telling a child's story is enabling the child to see the paths taken and all the elements encountered. It allows the child and others to have the child's journey in mind, making its life real and valorous. So when considering child development, it's not the grade that's important, it's not the stage of development that's important, it's everything put together within all the different contexts, and in considering the complexity of child development. That's what's important, and that's what we need to consider. So hunting, tracking, mapping, and eventually documenting is an approach to early childhood development and education that is interesting to consider, as we have seen. I took some time and I tried to imagine how we could document in an interesting way, if you wish, a child's developmental path and the course of the child's development, the course it's taken. And of course, there's many different ways of doing it. You can record it by writing, you can record it by video, you can record it in all sorts of manners. But you could illustrate the path or the course the child has taken in his development by highlighting the different events or different circumstances or the different elements that came into play in this complexity of the individual's development. I thought about it a long time, and I imagined trying to illustrate the path of development I took when I first encountered the representatives of the First Nations of Quebec and Labrador. As I said in the beginning, it was a very interesting experience, and it was a very complex situation also. So to try to illustrate it, because of course it had an impact on my development, it had an impact on my perspective. It changed my way of seeing child development as I went from developmental psychology and education to a more more First Nations approach, if you wish, of child development and education. And I learned to appreciate the value of it, the possibilities of it, and as such. So I looked at my path, and I said to myself, I'll try to illustrate it and give you an example of how we can document a path, a developmental path in a child. So I'll turn my computer here and show you something, a mural that I put together. And I don't know if you can see it properly. I'll get myself out of the picture. And you can see about, of course, you cannot, it would be too long to explain all the different events that occurred on my path, on my developmental path towards acquiring new knowledge about First Nations and early childhood education. But what I did here is I tried to remember what impacted on me, and I took note of the different elements that came into play. So I first encountered a whole team of people working in early childhood, in the early childhood team at the time. So different individuals from different nations with different perceptions, different reactions, and there was my reaction to that introduction, right? Then I moved and I went to live within a urban reserve called Wendake near Quebec City, and I lived there for a year to try to get a sense of the community and what was happening. I visited all the tourist attractions, if you wish, for First Nations that are present on the reserve, and then I met in the Assembly of First Nation leaders during one meeting that was very interesting for me. Eventually, there was a lot of meetings, a lot of exchanges that occurred that were part of my experience over there at Wendake. And of course, I met a lot of people, talked to a lot of people during several months in a row. Eventually, I flew out to different reserves across Quebec. I visited at least four reserves and met the people there within the child daycare centers where people are taking care of early childhood education within the reserves. Finally, I went through a process where I had to read and do a lot of research. This lasted months and months, lots of reading, lots of research, and coming in, discovering First Nations authors and what they had to say and what was their perspectives as such. I would say that one of the determining factors in my experience on my path was discovering oral cultures and trying to understand what that meant, trying to get a sense of how it works, how an oral culture works. And I must confess, it's very hard to understand. It's fascinating, but very complex, and etc. etc. So on my path, there was of course representatives of all the different nations. So in Quebec, there's 10 different nations, all different languages and all different cultures and ethnicities also within the First Nations. Through this, I had to deal with the Ministry of Family. Because we were working on a curriculum model, so necessarily this would have an impact on curriculum, on educational programs, if you wish. So, and so on and so on. So there were all these different events that occurred. And finally, we tabled the curriculum model, and the virus came and stopped everything, stopped everybody and everything in their tracks. And eventually, I was sent home to work from my office at home, and eventually the contract came to an end, and the curriculum model was shared with everyone. So this is a way of illustrating my story. It could serve as a model on how to illustrate a child's story, so that the child would be able to tell its own story, and the parents will be able to tell the child's story also. So I don't know if you found that interesting. It was, for me, an exercise that was very telling, because all the different elements that had an impact on me, and the impact that I had on others was determining and important. My presentation is now coming to an end. I hope you found it interesting. I would like to finish with talking about tracking and complexity. So I'll read the sentences on this slide to be as clear as I can. So tracking as an educational approach is close to the approach suggested by the postmodern complexity paradigm. Some of the thinkers and researchers who have discussed complexity are, for example, Edgar Morin, Gilles Deleuze, Félix Guattari, and Bernd Herzogenrath. Those are some of the authors. There are others also. So following modern era, the era of science, the era of capitalism, neoliberalism, we find ourselves into the postmodern era. And within this postmodern era, there is this paradigm of complexity that is brought forward. So what we've seen so far in hunting and tracking and mapping is linked to this paradigm. So when you looked at First Nations approach to early childhood education and what postmodern thinkers are bringing forth, there's a similarity, there's a closeness between the two approach that is worth looking into. Now, tracking as an educational approach is close to the posture of the RECE, the Reconceptualizing Early Childhood Education movement, where science is not rejected, but philosophy is put on an equal footing to understand child development. Among those thinkers and researchers, we find Peter Moss and Gunilla Dalbert, Gilles Brugère, Michel van der Broek, Maya Holmer-Nadesan, Erika Bergman, Joseph Tobin, etc., and Glenda McNewton, André Turmel, I cannot bypass also. So the outside developmental psychology in early childhood education, there's a whole world, a whole new world of looking to into child development. And again, when you look at using science and philosophy, and you look at hunting, tracking, mapping, the closeness between the two is interesting to look into. In the following slides, I have made available bibliography for both the postmodern complexity paradigm as well as the RECE movement to give you a chance to have a look at it if you are interested by it. So this is the end. I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and your patience. I hope you found it interesting. I encourage you to check out my blog on the NAAE website in the Early Childhood EE Pro group. You have, when you go on to the NAAE site, look for the yellow ladybug and you'll find me. So you can have a look at my blogs, and you can also find my email. If you want to contact me, please do so. It'll be a pleasure. Thanks again. Bye.